it, and I've been looking forward to coming back again. Now, Rachel tells me that you're doing this series on someone from the Bible who's inspired you. So she told me that's the mandate for today. So I thought, who am I going to talk about? And I thought, I'd like to talk to you about Joseph. Not the father of Jesus, but Joseph in the Old Testament. And Joseph, he was one of 12 brothers. And his dad was named Jacob or Israel, either name. And Joseph was he was the favourite son of his father. He was the favourite son because he was born to his favourite wife, who, interestingly, was a woman named Rachel. And I guess everyone named Rachel's been named after her in some way. And Joseph had a younger brother named Benjamin, and when his mum, Rachel, was giving birth to Benjamin, she died. And so this young brother, Benjamin, was much loved by Joseph. So let's have a read of the story. This is Genesis chapter 37. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he'd been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and couldn't speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he'd said. So Dad makes him this ornate robe. Now, Andrew Lloyd Webber made a musical out of this. He called it Jacob in His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's a great musical, actually. If you've ever seen it, you get a chance to see it. I mean, it's great. And so here's Joseph in his amazing Technicolor dreamcoat, and his brothers hated him. You know, he was Dad's favourite. The moral of the story is, you know, if you're a parent, don't have favourite kids. It doesn't work out well. You know, you'll regret it, you know. So the other thing about Joseph, he was a dreamer. So here he is asleep, and he has this dream, and these sheaves were growing, and Joseph's sheaves grew up bigger than the others, and the others all bowed down to them. It really gets you on side with your brothers, eh? And they thought, who's this upstart? Who does he think he is? You know, they're all going to bow down to us. Now, you know, there's a lot of people in life have a kind of dream for their lives. Now, I don't know if you're one of them. It would be great if you are, actually. I wasn't like that. When I finished school, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do, you know. So my parents sent me off to, I think they called it the vocational guidance. And I turned up at this place. We lived in Wellington, and this bloke gave me all these questions to answer. So I do all these questions. And the end of it, he said, "You ought to go into advertising." I guess in a funny kind of way, that's what I ended up doing, actually, advertising the gospel, but I don't think that's what they had in mind, really. So, but, you know, they tried various places in Wellington, and there weren't any openings with advertising agents. So I ended up working for an accountancy firm. Now, this is the most boring job that's ever occurred to the mind of man, because I wasn't just doing sums. I was checking other people's work. It's called auditing. It is unbelievably boring. So they sent you out to this office and you go around and you do ticks. By the end of the day, you were seeing ticks, you know. And it was just so... But something happened to me while I was working there, and that was Billy Graham came to town. Now, this is a long time ago. So I went along. I mean, thousands of people went. It was huge. This was in Wellington Athletic Park. About 50,000 people went. And for the first time in my life, I really heard about the message of Jesus. Because I kind of believed in God, I thought that much about it. But here he was saying that wasn't enough. You needed to be personally committed to Jesus. So at the end of his message, he says, I want you to get up out of your seat and come forward. And so I got up out of my seat and I went down the front. I committed my life to Jesus. And my whole life began to change. And then, because I had this incredibly boring job, I started to daydream. And I had this sort of daydream that came back to me so over and over again. And in this dream, I was standing and I was talking to hundreds of people. And I was telling them about Jesus. Now, this was just crazy, because there was one thing at school I just hated. It was when you had to do the class talk, and you put up in front of the class. I hated it. My knees would smite mightily one against the other. My tongue would cleave to the roof of my mouth, and I'd go dry in the mouth. I actually hated it. And so this was a crazy dream. Absolutely crazy. So Joseph had his dream too. But his brothers hated him because they thought he's up himself, and so they decided they'd get rid of him. So they sold him off to some slave traders, and went back and told his dad that he'd been killed by wild animals. So Joseph gets sent off as a slave, and he gets taken down to Egypt. So this is now in chapter 39 of Genesis. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who'd taken him there. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. So she tells her husband, so much for the slave. He tried to rape me. So when his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. So Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So here we go. We've got some pictures of this too. Here, this man Potiphar, he thought very highly of Joseph, but unfortunately his wife did too, and so she.
Just hold that one.
Is this one not working?
And turn that on. Just speak into this one.
Okay. All right. So he liked Joseph, but unfortunately his wife did too. So she says, "Come to bed with me," and so he flees, and she says, "This guy's been trying to rape me." And so Joseph ends up in jail. And we've got a picture of him here. I think we've got a picture of him in jail. Well, this is quite exciting, isn't it? Everything goes wrong. It's great. So, here we go. Joseph's in jail. So here he is. So much for his dream. So, are they coming to take me away, do you think? It's a kind of scary place to preach, eh? So Joseph in jail. So much for his dream. Yeah. So much for his dream. It's very often what happens actually if you have some kind of dream, the dream dies. It's a very common thing. So much for my crazy dream. Here I have this dream of, talking to all these people and stuff. And with my great hatred of getting up and talking to people. In our church, there was a young assistant minister, and he said we ought to have a youth service. And he said, you could preach at it. I thought, goodness me. But I did. And the result of it was a couple of young people made a commitment of their lives to Jesus. So I got asked to talk at some other youth groups around the place and so on. And people started saying to me, hey, you ought to be a preacher. So at this stage I met up with Marge, and we both went off to Scotland. I studied there in Edinburgh. And while I was studying there in Edinburgh, I got employed in a Church of Scotland church as a student assistant minister. And it was a rugged experience. The guy who was the minister there, he'd been in the army. And people in the church, when I'd go around visiting folk in the parish, they'd say to me, how do you get on with Frank? He was the minister. And I'd say, oh, with difficulty. And they said, I'm not surprised. They said, he still thinks he's in the army. And he was a hard man. Anyway, after I'd been there a few months, every year in Scotland, Scotland had a poet once, Robert Burns. And every year they have what they call the Burns Supper. And so they decided they were going to have a Burns Supper this year. And so Frank McKean, the minister, a person to ask me, at the Burns Supper, would I address the haggis? Now, I don't know what you say to a haggis, And so I said, well, no, I have no idea what to do. Tell him no, I won't do it. So anyway, he forgot to tell the minister. So that the great night arrives, and all these old people show up, and they call on the man from New Zealand to come and address the haggis, and the man from New Zealand wasn't even there. So the next day he came around to where we were staying. He came at the door, and he was angry. I mean, his face was purple, and he said, I've written out you got 6 weeks work and then you're sacked. I said, well, forget the 6 weeks, I'm going now. So that's how I left the Presbyterian church, actually. And we ended up worshipping in this little Baptist church, a bit like this, actually, in a really hard council housing area. And that's how we actually ended up with the Baptists. So much for having a great dream. And see, here's Joseph. He's in jail. His dream has died. But he still has this ability to interpret dreams. And so while he's there in prison, there's a couple of folks who have dreams, and Joseph's able to interpret them. And then one night, Pharaoh himself had a dream. This is in Genesis 41. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows were ugly and gaunt, ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. In the morning his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. And then there's one guy that his dream he interpreted in prison, told Pharaoh about this. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said that you can, when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answers he desires. So Pharaoh tells Joseph his dream, and it's just as I said to Pharaoh. Joseph said, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming through the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it was so severe. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So here we go. We've got some pictures, I think, of... here's Pharaoh. He's having a dream and he sees these sleek, fat cows. And then they're followed by 7 gaunt, starving-looking cows. And so Pharaoh ends up explaining it to Joseph. And then Joseph responds and tells Pharaoh what it's about. And Pharaoh says to him, well, seeing you're the only person who's going to understand this thing, you're going to be in charge of this whole operation. We're going to have 7 wonderful years when we'll store up the food, and then when 7 years of famine come, you're going to be the person who's going to be in charge of all this thing. So Joseph, after all his troubles, he finally ends up in charge of Pharaoh's food supply and so on. So eventually, Marge and I end up where God intended us to be as well, which was a little Baptist church not far from here. And the problem was it had been going for over 100 years. And after 100 years, there were about 40 or 50 people there, and they were nearly all elderly, and we were just in our mid-20s. So it was a terrible mismatch, really. And the first Sunday I was there was this old guy in the church, and he said to me, Sonny, he said, you're going to shed a lot of tears in this place, because there's been a lot of conflict in the church, And I thought, man, here's a fellow with a gift of encouragement, So we started up, and then the problem was there was one guy who actually ran the place. He was the church secretary and the treasurer, and he was in charge of the Sunday school, and he was the leader of the choir. They had this choir of elderly ladies that sang. So, and then after it had been about a month, he turned up at our place and he said, I'm resigning from everything, I'm out of here. So I accepted his resignation, and this old guy who told me that it was going to be, going to be shedding many tears, he came to me and he said, Sonny, he said, you're going to make a lot of decisions in this place, but you'll never make a better one than this one. But suddenly we had no secretary, no treasurer, no one leading the Sunday school, and the choir, well, we gave up with that anyway. That was one problem solved. But what it meant was that the whole place was sort of wiped clean, and we could start all over again. And that's what happened. So Joseph, here he is in Egypt, and the famine starts, and so Jacob says to his sons, you're going to have to go down there and see them. So to Joseph's amazement, his brothers show up. This is in chapter 42 we're up to now. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from, he asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. So he goes on and asks them a question, is your father still alive? Do you have a younger brother? And this sort of thing. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You've come to see where our land is unprotected. Now on the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back to your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and you may not die. This they proceeded to do. And they said to one another, surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They didn't realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep. But then he came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. So we've got some pictures of this too. Here's Jacob telling his sons, you're going to have to go to Egypt because they've got food there. And Joseph, to his amazement, after all these years, sees his brothers turn up. And they don't recognise him, of course, because he's some big shot Egyptian, with all the regalia of stuff. And he's speaking through an interpreter anyway. And he deals with them harshly because he wants to know, what's their attitude now to what they did to me? Have they learned anything from it? Are they repentant of it? Or are they just as stubborn as they were? And so he sends them back off and he says, you won't see my face again unless your younger brother's with you. So Jacob, he didn't want Benjamin to go as well. He said to them, look, I lost Joseph. I'm not going to lose Benjamin as well. You can't take him. But eventually he agreed that they could go. So in Genesis 43, so he gave the boys gifts, and the men took the gifts and double the amount of silver, and Benjamin also. They hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of the house, take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare a meal. They are to eat with me at noon. When Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts they had brought to the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, how is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? They replied, your servant, our father, is still alive and well. And they bowed down, prostrating themselves to the ground. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went to his private room and wept there. Tears are very much a part of this story from here on, because all these years had gone by and all the suffering that Joseph had been through, all because of this dreadful deed that his brothers had done to him. They at one stage talked about killing him, and then they sold him as a slave. And all these years in prison and all this, it all came back to him. The tears flowed, This is terrible. So the brothers come back, and he sees his young brother Benjamin. He hadn't seen him in years and years, and probably he was just a very little fellow when the older brothers got rid of him. And he can't contain himself anymore, so he goes off to a room and weeps. And then the climax of the story reached in chapter 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. So Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? Brothers were not able to answer him, because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. Then, when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there'll be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So we've got a couple of pictures, and here Joseph reveals himself. I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And they can't believe it. This has happened. There's a powerful story in the story of Joseph, that God actually will work out his purposes in your life. You might be in a place in your life when everything seems to have gone wrong. Like I had a couple of experiences like this where I thought, man, this was a crazy dream. This could never happen. But it did happen. And the day came to pass at this tiny little struggling church where an awful lot of people started showing up. And finally I ended up preaching to hundreds of people every week. It was amazing. And then Marge had a dream too. And her dream was that she would be a missionary overseas. And then she met me, which sort of ruined the thing really. And so she ends up at Spraydon as well. But then when the time was right, she trained as a teacher, English language teacher, ESOL teacher. And she developed the Spraydon English Language Centre. But she had this vision of using English teaching as a way of leading people to Jesus. And so she developed these teaching materials, which have actually gone all over the world and seen people come to faith in Jesus. And the message is that God can be trusted. You know, you might feel you're like Joseph sitting in jail and you think, good night, everything's gone wrong. You know, I thought God purposed good for me. And here I am, you know, where's any sign of it? The message of Joseph, it's just so powerful. And it's such an emotional story. The pain that is there and then the resolution of it all. It's a wonderful story. Then in the end, you know, the brothers gather around and they're just embracing and crying over each other. God has done this. You meant it for evil, Joseph said to them, but God purposed it for good. And sometimes you might feel, man, my life's just in the grip of evil, you know. There's no way out of this. But the message of Joseph is there is a way out of it. And God can be trusted through the darkest hours to achieve his purpose. And so hang on to the message of Joseph. It's a wonderful message. He's a great person to draw inspiration from. God bless you all.
Thank you for that encouragement, Murray, from the life of Joseph.